Hi, welcome to my presentation. I am Dr. Karl Wyant, the Director of Agronomy at Nutrien, and today we're going to talk about science-based nutrient management in times of high fertilizer prices. Let's do a quick recap on 2022. It has been a challenging 12 to 18 months on fertilizer price, fertilizer supply and logistics. There have been geopolitical and energy issues. At a little more close to home, we've had some challenges with erosion and pre-existing NPK issues, and that's soil fertility we're talking. But on the good news, we're seeing for the 2023 season yield demand that is coming from a strong market signal to say, hey, produce, and we'll reward you for that production. On a more regulatory level, we're seeing increased focus on doing more with less. So that's this idea of efficiency. Here, this term FUE refers to fertilizer use efficiency. There are several ways to manage it, but what we're looking to do is get more fertilizer in the crop and lose less of it to the environment. And so we have some tools to do that. We'll cover the 4 R's of fertilizer management, and we'll also briefly discuss these technical products that exist that can serve as an assist to your nutrient management program. One thing about the crop management and nutrient demand is that it's the same. It's always there, regardless of what's happening globally or locally. Those crops need nutrients, and these nutrients, usually delivered via fertilizer, are proven ways to drive yield and profitability. And with that, we know that soil fertility requires constant attention. So if we can keep an eye on what's in our soil, we can make better management decisions that move with the market and move with these fertilizer challenges that we've seen. Here's a graph that shows the global fertilizer affordability index going all the way back to 2003. So if you just follow that thick black line, you can see these fertilizer prices have moved, and you can see we've had some variation, particularly in 2008, and then things were relatively calm for a number of years, and you can see later here this 2021, 2022 affordability challenge, and we're seeing still some issues with affordability, but there is some optimism here for growers, and when they're purchasing their inputs, that it's going to be much more affordable, and hopefully some of these logistic challenges have been worked out of the supply chain that have been pent up. So let's just cover some 2023 watch-outs for the season, some things that we're seeing in our data with climate and with some of the other challenges we've seen with the nutrient demand that I mentioned earlier, where we have a yield goal and we're always pulling from our soils. Let's talk about that soil fertility. When we look at nutrient removals, and here we're showing the nutrient removals coming from 180 bushels an acre of corn, and this is grain corn, and this is from our Nutrien Economics website, and we're showing just the pull, and that's what I want to introduce, is how much are we demanding over the season. So if you follow our nutrients, the nitrogen, the phosphate, the potassium, and the sulfur, and you go all the way to the right side of the screen, you can see these uptake numbers, and these are pounds per acre. And you can see just incredible demand for nutrients, 234 pounds of nitrogen being taken up just for nitrogen alone, and then you have phosphate, potassium, and sulfur. So if you sat 2022 out and you didn't put as much fertilizer into your soils and into your crop and you removed it, you will need to think about, how do I replace those nutrients so I can keep my soil fertility up and hit my yield goals in the future. When we think about nutrient removal over time, that's where we really start to pay a nice picture of just how much we've accelerated nutrient removal. We're mining soils more than we ever have before. So if you look at this graph, I took the average yield for the United States for each year and graphed it all the way back to 1866, and then we have 3 colors. Blue is the pounds of nitrogen removed from that yield, the orange is the phosphate, and then the green color is the potassium. So you can see we're pulling more from our soils than we have before, so this need to look at soil fertility has never been greater. So what you used to be able to get away with in 1866, not today as what we're doing in 2022. And that's due to a number of technological changes. Here for corn, of course, we've had hybrids, we've had better seed technology, and we have these fertilizer tools that can support that genetic potential. What's the challenge with nutrients? The challenge with nutrients is that we need a lot. We know they drive profitability and yield, but we tend to lose them to the environment. Here's a graphic that shows how we're losing nitrogen. So in a perfect world, we put our nitrogen, and here it's the N with the circle around it, And in a perfect world, 100% of that nitrogen fertilizer would go up into the plant, and that's the green arrow. But the world's not perfect. We are losing nitrogen due to gassing off as either the ammonium gas or the dinitrogen gas through denitrification and volatilization. If you're in a wet area, you can have challenges with leaching, particularly on sandy soils, where that nitrate moves below the root zone and the crop can't use it. If you have runoff issues and erosion issues, you can actually carry your nitrogen fertilizer off the field, and that's not useful to your crop. So lots of reasons to use nitrogen fertilizer besides maintaining soil fertility and driving yield and profitability. But here, thinking about the management strategies. If we're going to pay for fertilizer, let's manage it so we're getting as much into the crop as possible. And of course, here's some pictures from our friends at Yara showing what does nitrogen deficiency look like. And I'm showing corn, and you can look at a number of different crops here. Nitrogen deficient corn, the image that's on the left side of the screen, small, yellow, spindly looking compared to its optimal nitrogen program on the far right of the picture of the plants. If we think about yield, you can really see the influence of nitrogen fertilizer and what happens if we start to short it. Either we're not putting enough out, or we're losing nitrogen fertilizer to the environment. We're not being very efficient with it. So two ways to drive nitrogen deficiency. So you can see here that impact on yield. Optimum nitrogen program, great looking corn ears. If we look at a nitrogen deficient program, you can just imagine the yield loss involved and the profitability loss that's tied to it. When we think about phosphorus and potassium, or P and K, we've got a little more wiggle room because P and K don't move as much in the soil or into the atmosphere like nitrogen does. Nitrogen is very much almost a seasonal management. P and K, you've got a little longer of a horizon on how you can manage it because it doesn't move quite as much. And that's where we need to introduce this idea of the critical level or the soil test level. One of your best tools for managing P and K is taking that soil test, and so you can make a plan that stretches out 4 to 5 years. So what does this critical level tell us? This critical level is a lot of work. It's work with the Extension Service, local agronomists, and local crop advisors to say, hey, when we're at this level in the soil, and there's different ways to manage it depending on where you're at in the country, there's different ways to report it, and it's the next step that's so important. What do I do with this number on the soil test? And that's where you get choices. If you are on the right of the critical level, you have a high critical level, you can start thinking about the fertilizer response. When we have that high critical level, we tend to not see as much of a yield response when we're above that optimum. So you might be able to sit out those high prices. If you're below that critical value, and this is where we see a lot of activity happening, especially as we have accelerated nutrient removal with our increasing crop yields over time, when we have our critical value to the left of our value, we see that fertilizer response is more likely. So if you're coming in low, that fertilizer investment really makes more sense, and your probability of seeing a yield response goes up. And so you have some of these probabilities you can play with, and then you have some other decisions. When we think about the strategy to improve soil fertility, you have two options when you're trying to either build it or maintain it, and that's in red. If you're very low on your tests, you need to start building. Your inputs of that nutrient, whether it's P or K, need to be higher than what you're removing, and you can build it over time. If you're just around your critical level, you have some options. You can maintain and try to match your inputs to your outputs, and that's where crop nutrient removal calculators come in. Make that plan so that your net is zero. If you're very high on a certain element, that's where you can get into some creative strategies with drawing nutrients down. And this is where you're on purpose, and you're purposely doing this. You're not putting out that element because you know you're high on the test. Lots of planning here. It starts with that soil test, and it starts with a good conversation with folks that have done these types of strategies to help make sure that your dollar that you're spending is optimized and tailored to your field. I mentioned the accelerated nutrient removal, and we can measure this over time, and we use our network of lab systems throughout the United States, and this is the soil test summary. We also extend this work into the Canadian provinces, and if you look closely at these black numbers that are on the screen, These are the percentage of soil samples that have come in for that state that are coming in below the critical level, and this is for phosphate. So you can see in some places like North Dakota, 77% of those soils are low in phosphate. They're below that critical value. They need to be building their soil phosphate, or at least doing something to maintain that loss for now. And some other places are in a different boat. If you go to some of our provinces up north, 34% are low in phosphate, below the critical level. So depending on where you're at, depending on your cropping mix, depending on your soils and geology, all influence how this responds to these years of cropping that we've accumulated. Of course, we see phosphorus deficient corn. Here's an image again from Yara showing that purpling for phosphorus deficient corn. Classic symptom that plant is calling for phosphate and it's not getting it. Most crops don't show this purpling, so just a word of warning. You will need to keep an eye on that soil test. Tissue tests can help forecast that if your plant's calling for phosphate and it's not getting it. They're not all going to go purple on you, so it takes some of that field scouting to find this out. Of course, phosphorus deficiency has an influence on yield. If you look at those ears, optimum phosphorus program, great yield. If you start cutting that phosphate back, or you don't have enough in your soil or fertilizer program, you can start to lose yield to a considerable degree. When we look at potassium deficiency, and again, this is the same soil test summary, we're starting to see an increased frequency of low potassium values. And again, it depends on the state. If you look at Wisconsin, 76% of those soil samples have come back low in potassium. But you go to some place like Montana, 9% are coming back. So it's got a little bit wider of a range, but we're still seeing this trend due to the accelerated nutrient removal of potassium levels that are coming in below that critical level, where we need to start adding more fertilizers to account for all the removal. And here's a picture again of potassium deficient corn. Just think about that yield loss when you compare the optimum program for potassium that's on the left with the program that has K deficiency that's on the right. So we know these macronutrients can influence yield, drive profitability, and drive ROI. Here just showing that impact. And every farm's a little bit different, every crop's a little bit different. So speaking of different crops, one thing that we've learned through all of our research at the extension centers and in the field over the over 100 years that we've been working with these soil tests is that this idea about the critical value, it stands up pretty strong to repeat examination. And here I'm showing the critical values for corn and soybeans, and you can see that shape of that graph. Where that critical value is fairly consistent despite these crops being so different. So depending on what you're growing, we see that this critical value is just a key metric to build into your observation network and build it into just the data you're bringing in to help drive decisions. So if we wanted to build phosphorus and potassium, there's some general rules of thumb. When you add 20 pounds of phosphate above crop removal, you should start to increase your soil test values 1 ppm at a time. So if you just add 20 pounds above what you're removing, you should get a 1 parts per million increase on your soil test. And that's where you can start planning. I want to be at this test value by this date. I can now plan how many extra pounds of phosphate to add above my crop removal. Same for potassium. Numbers are a little bit different. Principles are the same. 6 pounds of K added above crop removal, that should increase your soil test by 1 parts per million. I want to say this works both ways. If you are not adding enough phosphate or enough potassium, your soil test can start to drop. And that's what I showed on those maps, was just the soil tests that are starting to move backwards because we're not replacing enough phosphorus and potassium. Let's get to some good news for 2023 so we can end on an optimistic note. One thing we're seeing is some great planting intentions coming up. Corn acres are expected to be up, soybeans are expected to be flat, and wheat is expected to be up. So lots of room here to plant, a market that is looking for corn, soybeans, and wheat. And of course, we have some pricing structures that support that, and some global macroeconomic and political situations that are occurring to say, hey, this spring, it's a good year to grow these commodity crops. If you just look at the winter wheat planted acres here for 2023, of course they planted in 2022, but we're up about 11% in planted winter wheat acres. If you look at all those states that are in blue, those are states that had a substantial increase in winter wheat. So you can see the market reacting, saying, hey, wheat looks like a good crop, looks like a sure bet. And here we're seeing it shown over the geography across the United States. One thing we're seeing that's making it, I think, a lot of folks excited, including agronomists, is just this drought. We've been stuck in this 3-year La Nina event, and it's just caused considerable drought hangover. You know, what happens in 2022 can still impact 2023, and if you keep going back in time. So some areas have been just stuck in drought, and we're starting to see some relief. If you look at the drought outlook all the way into the end of May, and this was released just at the end of February, we're seeing substantial improvement, and that's the brown and the khaki-looking colors showing drought removal, or the drought remains but improves. So lots of acres are expected to improve for their drought status. Another piece to look at is the white. The white spaces on the map are the places that aren't expected to have any drought. So they could have great planting conditions, excellent moisture compared to what we've experienced over the last few years. I do want to just caution, we have some dark brown areas and some yellow. That's where we're expected to see droughts remain for planting season. So if you're in those areas, you could have some challenges with dry soil. But a lot of area of the countries are expected to come out of drought, and that should make planting this spring a lot more exciting and a lot more favorable for your yield goals and profitability. If you look at the soil moisture anomaly for March 9th, that's when we recorded this. Here we're seeing in the red, those are areas that have that hangover. That's dry soils that just happen because there hasn't been enough moisture over a prolonged period of time. So you can see that belt that moves across the plains from Texas north to North Dakota. One thing to also see is the green. We've had substantial improvement in soil moisture status across much of the western United States and in certain areas around the Great Lakes. And there's also lots of white, and that these white areas are not so over wet. They're not all that anomalous from the norm. So that could mean some really nice opportunity to plant into some great soils. So just look at all the white on this map and the green, and if you compare this to just 6 months ago, there was a lot more red and a lot more tough conditions to get through. So let's talk about moving forward. We've had some good news, we've had some bad news. Let's just talk about some of these management strategies for getting through these challenging volatility in the fertilizer markets. And that's where we get to this 4R management. The 4 R's, of course, are the right source, the right rate, the right time, and the right place. It's a management framework to help get more out of your nutrient dollar, get more into the crop, and lose less to the environment or other inefficiencies. So if you kind of look into these different menus to choose from, you've got a lot going on. If we start at the far left on the right source, we have soil tests. Great tool to figure out what's in my soil and what fertilizer can I pick that matches the actual needs based on data. So that's one of the great things about choosing the right source. Apply only what you need. Don't spend money on things you don't need that might be too high or might not be impacting your yield goals. You can also identify formulation assists, and this is the technology that other products can be brought into your blend to help drive that source. And you can say, hey, if I have trouble maybe holding on to nitrogen, I can bring in a different product to help keep my nitrogen there and keep it from going off as a gas into the atmosphere or leaching through the soil. So lots of great products out there, and if you haven't talked to your favorite crop advisor yet, talk to them about these assists, the technology you can bring into your traditional blends to drive efficiency. If we go to right rate, again, that's where soil tests come into play. If you have the right rate and you have a yield goal, you need to be making sure that you're feeding that yield goal based on reality. So the soil test can tell you what's in the bank account, and then your yield goal can say, hey, what do I need to add to the bank account to hit my yield goal? Not all fields are the same, and you can actually adjust your rate based on field productivity goals and soil test information. So this way we're avoiding over and under application, and so you're optimizing your input dollar. We can talk about the right time. The closer you apply your fertilizer to when your plant is actually taking it up and needing it, you're reducing your risk of fertilizer inefficiency or loss. So if we can split apply or change our times, we can actually align that crop uptake with application and reduce the loss risk. you just drove your efficiency up considerably by just making some tweaks on the time. And this is where you can also bring in some of those formulation assists to help you match up those times or extend the life of a fertilizer in the soil to when the plant actually needs it. And of course, we get to the right place. This is where you have a lot of options here, band versus broadcast application, where you place your fertilizer in the soil, whether it's a 2x2, whether it's in furrow, whether you need to use a liquid option or a foliar option. And again, information here is key, and so you can line up your timing and your placement and how much you're actually putting out with your crop goals and your field conditions based on soil sampling. So another strategy for getting through high fertilizer prices is your rotation. Not all crops remove the same amount of nutrients. So here I'm showing the P and K removal for corn and soybeans, common rotation, and we're showing the rotation for 230 bushel corn per acre and 60 bushels an acre for soybeans. And if you track those two columns that are on the right side of the screen, corn, of course, removing 88 pounds an acre of phosphorus for that yield goal and 62 pounds of potassium. But if you look at soybeans, different story, different crop, different biology. Soybeans at a 60 bushel an acre yield goal is only removing 48 pounds of phosphate, so just about half of what the corn is pulling out. But if you look at the potassium requirement, much higher at 78 pounds per acre of potassium. So depending on what fertilizer price is bugging you, you can actually rotate your way into adding crops that have higher or lower fertilizer requirements, and you can get through just these fertilizer prices just based on your rotation alone. However, I want to say, save now. You might be able to save a couple pounds of an acre. Say you go from corn into soybeans, you have an option now of not putting as much phosphorus out. But if you want to maintain your soil fertility, you will have to replace that later and keep an eye on your soil tests. So let's end with some key points. Nitrogen, phosphate, and potassium is non-substitutable. You have to have it. You have to have NPK to drive a whole list of biological and crop-specific processes if you want to push that yield and profitability at the end of the year. We've seen some creative reductions in fertilizer use, and folks that have really cut back on fertilizer, they've cost them some profitability because that yield is so strongly influenced by fertilizer needs. So keep that in mind. And really what we're thinking is not just a straight cut, it's about the optimization. And that's where planning comes into play. Data, I mentioned the phrase soil test several times. Use your data to drive fertilizer use efficiency so that for your field and for your yield goal, you are getting as much out of your fertilizer dollar as you possibly can. And using the 4R basics can be a great tool to bring in to your mix if you haven't done so yet. Product strategy is another way. Those formulation assists, things that help you extend the life of your fertilizer so you don't lose as much based on your logistics. If you haven't tried those yet, this is a great time in our crop history to bring some of those in. And there's lots of options. So if you're looking for advice, find that key partner in your operation that can say, hey, here's a great product, here's a great rate, here's what your soil test is telling me, here's all the options you have. Remember the 4R menu. You can choose from different bullet points there just based on your operation alone. So finding that key partner if you're new to this or just to run ideas by is a great place to start the year as we're coming into plant 2023. So again, those 4R nutrient stewardship, we can leverage different management techniques or rotation techniques, and our goal here is to drive up our fertilizer use efficiency. And here just showing some ranges. Nitrogen can be 30 to 70% efficient. 70% is someone doing a really nice job. 70% of that nitrogen fertilizer made it into the crop, and there's lots of ways to get there. If you're very inefficient, you're sticking around 30%. Phosphorus is around 5% to 30%. Lots of hidden tricky chemistry in the soil that's getting in the way of your phosphorus program. Again, 4R basics, how you're putting it out, broadcast versus band, great ways to get around some of those challenges that reduce your phosphorus fertilizer efficiency. And then potassium. Potassium, similar to nitrogen, 30 to 60%. Again, there's tools to just push those numbers to the right, drive those efficiencies, and get the most from your fertilizer dollar. And with that, I close up my talk. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your attention. If you'd like more information, please visit our website at nutrien-economics.com. That's economics with a K. Thank you. Have a great day.